This is the second presentation in the series of 3 on teaching trauma. And welcome back, and let's get started. So, as you see here, yes, trauma is a factor in the classroom. And as we left off in presentation 1, talking about the fact that students who encounter these difficult knowledge, content, historical events, oftentimes, even unconsciously, begin to experience existential fear and anxiety. And so, one of the ways that we said that teachers can think about dealing with this is through TMT, applying some of the principles of TMT, which is terror management theory, as it relates to students in the classroom. So, yes, trauma is a factor in the classroom. So, some ways that trauma shows up in the classroom are laid out for you here. And there are more ways, but these are the primary ways that we want to look at, and they are the primary ways that tend to show up in classrooms. And so students have personal trauma, students have vicarious trauma through secondary stress, classrooms have dynamics and peer interactions that help to trigger or reunite trauma that students have experienced or encountered. And then there's content related trauma. And so as you look at these, just take a few moments to read over them. Take about 60 seconds and pause the video while you look at these, and then come back and we'll talk a little bit more about content related trauma. So pause the video right now and really read over each of these bullets. So now that you've had some time to read over the information presented to you here, we look at things that we're very familiar with when we think about trauma, when we talk about student personal trauma, in which, these are things that come from their personal experiences, things that happen at home or happen to them anywhere, but things people have experienced. That secondary stress, where students may not be personally involved in something like having that student personal drama, but living vicariously through the experiences of others creates that emotional burden, that emotional drain, because that trauma they're now taking on as their trauma and maybe often don't even realize it. And then looking at actually what goes on in the classroom when talking about topics can reignite something that happened in their personal trauma or even in that secondary stress with that vicarious trauma. So any of these things can lead to disengagement of students. But this last one is where you really want to live, and that is that content related trauma. So when students are engaging in these difficult histories, this difficult knowledge, difficult content, like the Holocaust and genocides, there is that potential of triggering emotions that are tied to something personal or their cultural identity, their experiences, their cultural experiences. Um, you see those existential fears surfacing, which is how understanding TMT can help us as informed um, about trauma and causing students to have just different kinds of behaviors. And so when you look at this, the question comes as to, well, why? We've got so many other things. Why now are we talking about understanding TMT? Well, the why does matter for both the student and the teacher and the instruction. When you look at student behavior, that's when they start to disengage. So trauma impacts how they learn, but also how they engage with you and those around them, which then impacts their behavior. And also recognizing it matters for the teachers because of the teacher's behavior. Because when the teacher recognizes that trauma and they're teaching and they need to be informed and have trauma informed approaches, then this helps the teacher respond to the student reactions, to even anticipate running into those reactions. And then understanding instead of getting frustrated or even the teacher shutting down and checking out. And so student behavior and teacher behavior all is important, and it is important in the giving and receiving of instruction. So if you are a trauma informed teacher, you knowing this are able to adjust so that you anticipate and you can respond to your students' reactions and do it empathetically. You can avoid or try to avoid potentially re-traumatizing students, and you're planning and you are avidly working to always create a space in your classroom where when you're teaching this difficult knowledge, the content is something that you're going to be able to explore and have students explore without overwhelming them emotionally and running the risk of them shutting down or even acting out. And so, traumatic historical events significantly affect students by impacting them cognitively, emotionally, and how they regulate their emotions, and it impacts them in their social interactions. So all of these things are important because those three things help lead to issues in the classroom that you see their existential fear or their anxieties kicking in. And you can see them in either disruptive behavior or they can shut down or withdraw from whatever you're doing in your classroom. And you're having to do things like tap kids on the shoulder, ask them to wake up, ask them to sit up, looking at them, and you see them looking back and they look as if they're like daydreaming, but they're actually really checking out. And it mentally, they may not even be aware of it because the brain is shutting down emotionally to protect them. And so these events can really push students into a survival mode, making it really hard for them to focus on learning, which is what you want them to do, and even to engage positively in the classroom as you're going through these lessons. So you as a teacher really need to be able to understand this, and so you can adopt a more trauma informed approach to support students and their well-being and their academic success. So as you're looking at that, we know that trauma is present in every classroom. There is no one's classroom where trauma isn't present, and that is to include a classroom that may not even be teaching difficult knowledge, difficult content, difficult historical events. But for certain, in a Holocaust and Genocide studies class, in a class that is getting ready to start doing a research and learning discussion on topics related to the Holocaust or related to some other genocide, trauma is most definitely present in that classroom. And so the goal of trauma informed teaching isn't to get rid of any discomfort that might come as a result of teaching this difficult knowledge, but to create safe ways for the students to engage with this difficult content while at the same time supporting their emotional well-being. So trauma is present in every classroom, but particularly in classrooms where we're teaching about the Holocaust and other genocides, the goal is to become a trauma-informed teacher so that you can eliminate the discomfort. The discomfort is going to be there. This, I don't want students to be uncomfortable. That you can't get away from that in life. You can't get away from that when you're learning, particularly with trauma and traumatic events, historical events. And so the terror management theory that we ended the first presentation with, let's bring this into the classroom. TMT becomes present when students are learning about events or beliefs that remind them inevitably of death and horror. When they call one of their personal fundamental truths into question, that then puts them in a space where they are now uncomfortable in the worldview they have been holding. So TMT will act as a survival mechanism, terror management theory. It acts as a survival mechanism for the student, for the individual, for the adult, even. And it produces defensive reactions to avoid when learning about that topic. Because remember, this existential fear, anxiety has crept in. And most oftentimes, remember, it is what? Yes, you have it. You got it. It is unconscious. It's often unconscious. So, in a genocide classroom and a classroom teaching about the Holocaust and other genocides, this reaction may be present when your students are exposed to all of the different events you're teaching about when you're teaching those histories. And as they begin to learn and identify, they may identify with the perpetrators or the collaborators. We don't know. Or when images are presented in the primary sources that you show them, and they spark images of death and fear, and this begins to challenge their worldview of how the world works for them, how they feel it should work, and anything that challenges anybody's worldview, and for you, it is going to be you because you are the teacher who is teaching this. So you are, quote unquote, the challenger. As you're teaching this, it may be that you are the person challenging their worldview, and this heightens their anxiety and may present a situation where now their behavior is impacted because they're going to shut down or they may even lash out. Key here, what you see in red is does not excuse anything. We're just trying to explain it. This is real. This is what the body does. This is what emotions do. This is what happens. So to be informed of this better prepares you to be able to control or to plan for and help guide and have a better environment for learning. And so looking at the graphic again, it's kind of explain this. Okay, teacher presents the content. Say you're going to put up an image of something from when the liberators went in, and you see all these troubling images. The student sees these images. They're listening. They're hearing you talk about the history behind it, what the account is, um, and they're trying to engage in the classroom lesson and discussion, but they're so grounded in death and atrocity and anguish. But that's the content. So now, as they're getting this content, now comes the trigger. And the student is reminded of death. They're reminded of destruction. And remember, you don't know what they remember their personal traumas are that they brought in. You don't know what their vicarious traumas are that they brought in. And so now the content that you're teaching triggers feelings that challenge their worldview, what fundamentally they've known, what's safe for them, what's acceptable. And if they're learning um, something that is even closer to them um, in terms of their culture, what they believe in their religion, where they're from nationally, or their ancestry, that complicates things even more. So they may begin to experience this existential anxiety or fear and not even realize it. And once again, we go back to it's usually an unconscious anxiety. And so the students don't really recognize what's going on. They don't. That's why being a trauma informed teacher helps you then begin to recognize the students' reactions. So the students may begin to exhibit defensive reactions, such as this. And defensive doesn't always mean acting out, although it can, as you see here, but it could just be shutting things down, trying to avoid the topics. And one thing that happens sometimes when students are trying to avoid a topic, you may begin to see the class clown. Once again, this act lashing out doesn't have to be violent or rude. It could be them being the class clown, but you begin to be able to recognize maybe why these behaviors are beginning to surface. And so, in short, the student may not be reacting to the content alone. They may be reacting to what this content does to their sense of identity, to their sense of meaning in the world, their worldview, and basically to what they feel is safe. And so, if you recognize that teaching this has this potential, and it helps you because with the teacher, the question is, why does it matter? It matters, as you see here, because you are, as I say, the messenger of truth, as it said in the previous slide, the challenger, AKA you may be seen as the challenge. And so you're the messenger of this information. You're introducing this to them, and kind of up, upsetting the apple cart and destabilizing their sense of how the world's supposed to work. And so understanding TMT helps you understand these reactions, that they are psychological survival mechanisms. They're not conscious choices primarily. Usually they're not conscious decisions that students are making to shut down, to act out, to suddenly start getting their class clown on. They are usually unconscious, and that students are protecting their sense of order, morality, in a world that now you've just kind of upset. So it once again doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps us as the teacher respond with empathy to have structure in controlling the class and guiding the class and being able to support the students in their learning. And so we come to the end of presentation 2, and keep in mind, these are the reasons that TMT does matter to the teacher. And so as we end this, feel free to go back and review some of the things in either the first presentation or this presentation as you prepare for the final presentation in this module, which will be presentation number 3. And you may start it whenever you're ready.